Hello, students. You're reading one of my favorite poets in the world today, Robert Frost. And so I wanted to indulge in telling you just a little bit about one of his poems. But I promise it will be worth your while because watching this screencast is going to prepare you for the writing assignment that you'll have to do um, before midnight on Thursday. So I want us to take a brief look at Robert Frost's poem, The Woodpile. So as with a lot of his poetry, there is some rhyme, there is a fairly regular meter, and I hope you notice that a lot of Robert Frost's poems tell stories. They are driven by some kind of narrative. Um, Someone is fixing a wall. There is somebody who is returned to a farm and then dies. Something usually happens, something significant usually happens in a Robert Frost poem. Now, this one, The Woodpile, may seem to break that pattern. It may seem like nothing really important at all happens. In fact, on the surface, all that we can really see that's going on is the speaker takes a walk through a swamp, he follows a bird for a little while, and then he sees a stack of wood that was cut several years ago, and the wood itself has started to break down and to rot. The woodpile slumps as the wood breaks down. Um, but I think with just a little bit of thinking, we might recognize that this poem is about more than what's going on the surface level. So I want us to talk about close reading it and finding out what else might be going on. And it's a pretty safe bet for a lot of poems that poets are at least thinking about poetry itself. And spoiler alert, this poem I think is actually very much about poetry and what poetry should be and how the poet should think about it. Um, so the first thing that kind of leads me to that conclusion is the actual shape of this poem. It's almost like a stack of lumber, or if you turned it on its edge, if you rotated your screen either direction, it almost has the shape of a woodpile, 4 by 4 by 8, right? So maybe it's even shaped like a woodpile. Um, Maybe that's a clue. But there's even stronger evidence that Frost is thinking about poetry as he's writing this poem. So a couple of the lines that I noticed um, that led me in that direction. Um, Having trouble spotting the word that I want. So first of all, remember that Robert Frost writes poems with meter and rhyme. He is measuring out his poetry. It is meant to fit into a certain kind of pattern. And in fact, Robert Frost famously said once that writing poetry without rhyme would be like playing tennis without a net. So if you ever played tennis, you might be frustrated by the net, but it's really not that impressive a sport if the challenge of the net is not there. And so the fact that he's thinking about firewood as being measured, hence I think that he's also thinking about his own poetry as being carefully measured and metered out. Um, so that's certainly one clue. And the other thing that leads me to this suggestion or this idea is that Frost was not a huge tinkerer with his poetry. Once it was published, he kind of stuck with the version he had published and didn't publish revised versions of it, which we'll talk about in a minute. Marianne Moore was very different from that. And if you remember, Walt Whitman also was a famous tinkerer and changer and expander. The poem itself was always in process. But look at the way this poem ends. I thought that only someone who lived in turning to fresh tasks could so forget his handiwork on which he spent himself, the labor of his axe, and leave it there far from a useful fireplace to warm the frozen swamp as best it could with the slow, smokeless burning of decay. So Frost, or the speaker of this poem, decides this pile of firewood has been abandoned. The only burning that's happening is rot. Um, the wood pile is rotting, it's slumping down, it's sinking. But notice that he still describes that as a kind of burning that provides warmth, right? So if you've heated a house with wood before, you know how good a wood fire can feel. Frost suggests that even if that wood is forgotten and left out in nature, it's still providing some kind of warmth, so there's still some kind of value there. And I think that that's really the way that poetry works sometimes. A poem is going to outlive a poet. At some point, everybody has to kind of abandon whatever poems they have written. And I think the hope is that the poems will continue to have meaning, that they will continue to live, or even if they do kind of break down and metaphorically rot, they will still do some kind of good, right? And so as I was thinking about this poem, I wanted to share some details with you about it. And then I also wanted to show you a sample paragraph where I've incorporated some evidence to make that kind of argument. So if you read the full announcement email, you'll know that I am going to give you a topic sentence, and then you'll have to fill out the rest of the paragraph with quotations that prove the claim made in the topic sentence. So here's the topic sentence of this paragraph. Robert Frost, The Woodpile, is about both a literal pile of stacked wood as well as what a poem should be. And from that topic sentence, I go on to include 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 quotations from the poem. And some of the quotations are very short, even a single word, and that's fine. That's fine. You don't have to quote multiple lines at a time. Even a single word can help you make a point about what a poem means. So if you want to just read this paragraph, just pause the screencast and read it, and you can refer back to it as an example. But before I conclude, I did mention to you that Marianne Moore was quite different from Robert Frost in her attitudes about when a poem was finished, when she could take her hands off of it and leave it alone. So I'm going to have you all working with this particular poem, Poetry, and the title itself gives you a very strong clue about what it's about, right? So this is Marianne Moore's Attitudes and Beliefs about Poetry. Now, our footnote here tells us that this version follows the text and format of selected poems published in 1935. Marianne Moore changed this poem very dramatically and republished it quite a bit different from the way it appears here. And actually, so everything that happens after the word genuine, so all of the material you're going to read carefully as you think about making your argument about or supplying the evidence for the argument in the assignment, all the stuff after the word genuine, she just cut and threw out. And the final version of this poem that she published went like this. Poetry. I too dislike it. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. So she finally decided that that was enough. That was the heart of the poem. Everything else was unnecessary. So she did not believe, as Frost did, that poems should be abandoned. Once they were written, they were meant to just go out into the world and do the best that they could. So even though we've been using the same question to measure all of these modernist poets, and even though they are all part of the same literary movement, recognize that there are differences, and there are sometimes significant differences and even some tensions between these modernist poets. Okay, thank you.